The Bible hit the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 78 years old now, but the memory of that August afternoon in 1969 remains sharp as broken glass. The day I found the note. The day everything I believed shattered into 1,000 dangerous pieces. I was 29 then, married for 10 years to Richard, a man everyone in our Virginia town respected. The bank's accountant. Always impeccable. Always trusted. Always wearing those expensive suits that made him look like he belonged in a bigger city, not our small town where everyone knew everyone's business. We had 2 children, Daniel, 8, and Sophie, 6. Our house sat on a tree-lined street, modest but comfortable, with a small garden where I grew dahlias that the neighbors admired. Our life looked perfect from the outside.
Picture perfect, people said.
But perfection is often just a mask for rot underneath. But before I begin, if you're watching this, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the Grandma's Revenge channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It was 1969, and America was tearing itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights. But in our little Virginia town, life moved at its own quiet pace, as if the chaos beyond our borders didn't exist. I was what they called the perfect wife back then. I woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, the smell of homemade bread filling the house while I dressed the children for school. Richard had his coffee while reading the morning paper, and I never questioned why he sometimes folded certain pages before I could see them. After everyone left, I cleaned the house, did laundry, and in my spare time, I sewed for select clients in town. It was my mother who taught me to sew. "A woman needs a craft in her hands to never be in need," she'd said. Little did she know how prophetic those words would become. Our marriage seemed stable in the eyes of others. Richard was affectionate when we had visitors, brought gifts on special occasions, kept food on the table. But behind closed doors, there were long silences, unexplained absences, and that persistent feeling that something important was always just out of my reach. Richard traveled frequently for work, especially on the first Thursday of each month. "Bank business," he'd say vaguely when I asked. I believed him. Or perhaps I forced myself to believe because questioning wasn't welcome in our home. Once, when I asked for more details about one of these trips, he looked at me with eyes colder than I'd ever seen. "You have a roof over your head and food on the table. You don't need to know more than that." I learned to stop asking. That Sunday, August 17th, 1969, my life changed forever. I remember the date perfectly because it was my mother's birthday. God rest her soul. The children were at Richard's mother's house for Sunday lunch. Richard had left early, claiming he needed to resolve urgent paperwork at the bank before a major transfer the following week. I was alone at home, fighting a migraine so severe it created bright spots in my vision. The pain was excruciating, the kind that makes you nauseous and desperate for relief. I knew Richard kept strong painkillers in his office, medications he brought from New York that worked better than any herbal remedy my mother had taught me to make. Richard's office was forbidden territory. "A man needs a space where he can think without interruptions," he'd say whenever I asked about the locked door. The children weren't allowed in there either. It was his sanctuary, his private domain. But that day, the pain spoke louder than respect for unspoken rules. The door was closed but unlocked. He only locked it when he was away for longer trips. I entered slowly, my head pounding, searching for relief. The room was somber. Dark wooden desk. Leather armchair that smelled faintly of cigars. Shelves lined with books I doubted he actually read. They looked more like props, there for show. The air held that peculiar scent. Tobacco, old paper, and the expensive cologne he only wore on business trips. I knew the medications were in the top drawer among his personal items. While searching through pens, paper clips, and official-looking documents, a wave of dizziness hit me so hard I had to grab the bookshelf to keep from falling. The movement dislodged several books. The leather-bound Bible, a family heirloom Richard displayed with such pride, though I'd never seen him open it for actual reading, fell to the floor with a dull thud that seemed to reverberate through my chest. The Bible opened as it fell, and from between its yellowed pages slipped a small folded piece of paper. My first instinct was to put everything back exactly as it was. Richard would be furious if he knew I was in here, touching his things. But something, call it instinct, call it fate, made me pick up that paper. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was Edward's, the bank manager and Richard's closest friend. I recognized it immediately from years of Christmas cards, birthday wishes, casual notes about dinner invitations. The message was short, terrifyingly short. If she discovers the truth, kill her. The blood froze in my veins. The migraine vanished, replaced by a numbness that spread through my entire body. My legs weakened, and I had to sit in Richard's leather chair, that forbidden throne, to keep from collapsing. Who was she? Was it me? What truth was so terrible that it warranted murder? 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind in those seconds that felt like hours. Memories I'd dismissed. Strange phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Business trips that seemed too frequent. The way Richard sometimes looked at me across the dinner table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it calculation? Assessment? Planning? My hands shook as I carefully folded the note and returned it to its place between the pages of Proverbs. The Bible went back on the shelf, positioned exactly as it had been. I found the painkillers, took one with shaking hands, and left the office, making sure everything appeared untouched. I lay down in the living room, pretending to rest, but my mind was spinning in 1,000 directions. When Richard returned with the children late that afternoon, I had already made my decision. I would not confront him directly. If that note meant what I feared, questioning Richard could be signing my own death warrant. Instead, I would pretend nothing had happened. I would smile and serve dinner and listen to the children's stories while I secretly discovered the truth on my own. That night, I was the perfect wife again. I served Richard's favorite pot roast, laughed at his unfunny jokes, listened to Daniel and Sophie chattering about their day at Grandma's house. On the outside, I was the same Eleanor as always. On the inside, something fundamental had shattered. The obedient wife was gone. In her place, a woman fighting for survival. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps approaching. Every time Richard shifted in bed beside me, I tensed, wondering if tonight would be the night. Every morning when I woke, there was a split second of surprise that I was still alive. The fear was constant, gnawing, exhausting. But I couldn't let it paralyze me. I had to know the truth. What was Richard planning? Why would Edward write such a note? What would warrant killing me? The questions haunted me, but asking them directly could trigger exactly what that note threatened. So I became a spy in my own home. The following days were an exercise in careful acting. I maintained the routine perfectly. Breakfast ready by 7 a.m. Children dressed and ready for school. House cleaned. Dinner on the table at 6 p.m. sharp. But beneath the surface, I was watching, observing, recording every detail. I noticed things I dismissed before as unimportant. How Richard always locked the desk drawer before leaving, even if he was just going to the living room. How he hid papers quickly when I entered his office unexpectedly. How his phone conversations dropped to whispers when he thought I was occupied with the children or cooking. How his eyes sometimes tracked me across the room with an intensity that now made my skin crawl. 1 week after finding the note, I made my first concrete discovery. I was ironing Richard's shirts, preparing them for his next business trip, when I found something crumpled in the inner pocket of his best suit jacket. A receipt from a jewelry store in Richmond, the neighboring city. The amount made my breath catch. It was exorbitant, almost 3 times what Richard gave me each month for all household expenses, groceries, clothing for the children, everything. The purchased item, an engagement ring with a solitaire diamond. I stood there with the hot iron in one hand and the receipt in the other, feeling as if I'd been slapped. Richard had never given me expensive jewelry. My wedding band was simple gold, purchased from a local jeweler. I had some costume jewelry pieces inherited from my mother, but nothing valuable. Who was that expensive ring for? My hands were shaking as I continued searching the pocket. A small card fell out, with an address scrawled in Richard's handwriting. A Richmond address. I memorized both, the jewelry store, the address, then carefully returned everything exactly as I'd found it. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. One wrong move, one sign that I discovered something, and that note became more than just words. I had to be smarter than Richard, more careful, more calculating. Over the next few days, I created excuses to visit Richmond. I needed special fabrics for my sewing that weren't available locally. A cousin was ill and needed visiting. Sophie's birthday was coming, and I wanted to find her something special at the bigger stores. Each trip, I felt Richard's eyes on me before I left. Going to Richmond again? He'd ask casually, but I sensed something underneath. Watchfulness, maybe suspicion. Mrs. Patterson wants silk for her anniversary dress. I'd reply smoothly. Can't find quality silk here. He'd nod, return to his newspaper, but I felt his gaze follow me to the door. On my third trip to Richmond, I found the house. The address from Richard's pocket led me to an elegant neighborhood, far nicer than our modest street. The houses here were larger, newer, with manicured lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. I parked down the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. What was I doing? What would I find? A woman was watering the garden next door. I approached her, keeping my voice light and curious, as if I were just a newcomer to the neighborhood. Excuse me, I'm looking for my cousin's house, but I seem to be lost. Do you know who lives at number 47? The woman smiled, friendly and unsuspecting. Oh, that's the young teacher's house. Mary Ann. Such a lovely girl. Pregnant now, about 7 months along, I'd say. Her fiancé visits every Thursday, works in another city, the poor thing. They say they'll marry as soon as he resolves some complications with his ex-wife. Each word was a knife. First Thursday of the month. Richard's business trips. The ex-wife.
Me.
Already being referred to in the past tense while I still cooked his meals and ironed his shirts. I thanked the woman and returned to my car, where I sat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe normally. This wasn't just infidelity. This was something bigger, more dangerous. The note, the expensive ring, the double life. Richard was planning something that required my complete silence. Or my permanent absence. I drove home in a daze, constantly checking my rearview mirror, paranoid that I was being followed. Every car seemed suspicious. Every stranger's glance felt loaded with threat. When I arrived home, Richard was already there, which was unusual. He was in the living room, reading the paper, but something about his posture seemed tense. How is Richmond? He asked without looking up.
Fine.
Found the silk, I replied, holding up the bag I'd made sure to actually purchase. Mrs. Patterson will be pleased.
He nodded, still not looking at me.
You've been going to Richmond quite a bit lately. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The selection is better there. You know how particular my clients are. He turned the page of his newspaper. Just seems like a lot of trips. I forced a laugh. Would you prefer I lose my best clients? He finally looked up, and for just a second, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Suspicion? Calculation? Of course not, Eleanor. A woman needs her hobbies. Hobbies. As if my work, the work that contributed real money to our household, was just a pastime to keep me occupied. That night, I couldn't eat dinner. I pushed food around my plate while Richard talked about his day, while Daniel told us about a science project, while Sophie showed us her latest drawing. The normal family scene felt surreal, nightmarish. I excused myself early, claiming the migraine was returning, and lay in the dark bedroom with my eyes wide open, listening to Richard's footsteps downstairs. What was I going to do? What could I do? I needed more information, but gathering it felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. One wrong step, and everything would explode. I befriended Mrs. Brennan, the bank's new secretary, a widow who'd recently moved to town. She was lonely, eager for companionship, and I made sure to provide it through carefully casual conversations at church, at the market, after Sunday services. I never asked direct questions about Richard. Instead, I let her talk about her work, about the bank, about the people she'd met. We're all so terribly busy lately, she mentioned one Sunday after church, while we stood in the parking lot. This enormous transfer happening at the end of the month has everyone working overtime. Your husband and Mr. Edward have been staying late almost every evening, reviewing documents, preparing paperwork. I've never seen so much money in one place in my entire life. My heart began to race, but I kept my expression mildly interested. A transfer? Richard mentioned something about it, but you know how he is. Doesn't like bringing work worries home. Oh, it's for the textile factory expansion, Mrs. Brennan continued, oblivious to how every word was changing my world. $500,000 coming in for the construction. Mr. Edward jokes that we should all just take a handful and run. She laughed at her own comment. Oh, it's for the textile factory expansion, Mrs. Brennan continued, oblivious to how every word was changing my world. $500,000 coming in for the construction. Mr. Edward jokes that we should all just take a handful and run. She laughed at her own comment. I laughed too, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Richard mentioned he has a special business trip coming up around that time. Something about the transfer, I assume. Yes, he did mention a trip. Sanctimonious, he'd call him. Impossible to deal with. Acts like everyone's corrupt. Which meant Inspector Morrison was exactly who I needed. Through Mrs. Brennan, I learned he'd be in town the following week for a routine inspection. He'd be staying at the Wayward Inn for 3 days. I couldn't risk being seen delivering evidence directly. The inn was in the center of town where everyone would notice Eleanor Hayes walking in with a mysterious package. Gossip traveled faster than light in our small town. But I had an idea. Sophie had recently become friends with Marietta, daughter of Mrs. Cooper who owned the inn. I suggested a playdate, offered to drop Sophie off after school so the girls could play together. What a lovely purse, Mrs. Cooper, I commented when I picked up Sophie later, admiring a handbag hanging behind the counter. The colors would coordinate perfectly with the dress I'm making for Father Anselm's birthday party. Could I possibly borrow it to check the measurements for the matching accessories? I'll return it this evening. Mrs. Cooper, flattered and unsuspecting, handed over the purse without hesitation. At home, I worked quickly. I'd prepared everything in advance. Copies of the most damning documents I'd photographed, prints of the photos showing the tickets and fake IDs, and a detailed letter explaining everything. The note in the Bible, my investigation, the discoveries about Marianne, the embezzlement scheme tied to the upcoming transfer. I sealed it all in a manila envelope and hid it in the inner lining of Mrs. Cooper's purse, along with a note written in careful handwriting unlike my own. Please deliver this envelope to Inspector Morrison when he arrives for his inspection. Do not mention who gave this to you. A life depends on your discretion. Thank you. I returned the purse that evening with profuse thanks. Mrs. Cooper never suspected the deadly secret hidden in its lining. Now, all I could do was wait and pray that Inspector Morrison would take the evidence seriously, that he'd investigate before Richard and Edward could flee, that he'd act in time, because if he didn't, I had maybe 10 days left to live. The days that followed were the longest of my life. Every morning I woke up surprised to be alive. Every meal I prepared could be my last. Every time Richard looked at me, I wondered if he saw through my performance. I opened a bank account in Richmond under my own name, something women rarely did in 1969, but Mrs. Patterson, one of my wealthier clients, took me to her bank and vouched for me. Every woman should have her own money, she'd said firmly when I'd mentioned Richard controlled all our finances. I don't care what your husband thinks. I deposited all the money I'd secretly saved from my sewing over the past 5 years. It wasn't much, maybe enough for first and last month's rent on a small apartment, food for a few weeks. But it was mine.
Hidden.
A lifeline if everything went wrong. I contacted my childhood friend Louise, who lived in the capital. I didn't tell her everything, just that my marriage was ending and I might need a place to stay soon with 2 children. Come whenever you need to, Louise said without hesitation. I have a small room behind my sewing studio. It's not much, but it's yours. I packed 2 small bags with essential clothes for the children and hid them under my bed. Birth certificates, vaccination records, social security cards, all the important documents went into a folder I could grab in seconds. If I needed to run, I'd be ready. Meanwhile, Richard grew increasingly tense. I caught him staring at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read. Assessment? Suspicion? Guilt? 1 week before the transfer, he came home early and found me in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Eleanor," he said, watching me chop vegetables, "have you been in my office?" My heart stopped. "Your office?" "No, why?" Some papers seemed moved, slightly out of place. I kept chopping, keeping my movements steady despite my racing pulse. "The children, maybe? I've told them 100 times not to go in there, but you know how curious they are." "I suppose."
He didn't sound convinced.
That night, I heard him on the phone in his office, voice too low to make out words, but the tone was urgent. Worried. Had he noticed the documents I'd photographed? Did he suspect I knew? The next morning, Mrs. Brennan stopped by my house with the pretense of ordering a dress. She leaned close while I took her measurements. "Inspector Morrison arrived yesterday," she whispered. "He requested extensive documentation, all transfers from the past 6 months, account records, everything. Mr. Edward and your husband have been locked in meetings all day. They look terrible, Mrs. Hayes. Absolutely terrified." My hands trembled as I wrote down her measurements. "I'm sure it's just routine." "Perhaps." She looked at me with concerned eyes. "Are you all right? You seem unwell." "Just tired," I lied. "Sophie had nightmares last night." That evening, Richard barely spoke during dinner. He pushed food around his plate, his face ashen. When Daniel asked him a question about mathematics, he snapped at the boy, then immediately apologized. After the children went to bed, he poured himself a drink, unusual for Richard, who rarely drank at home. "Is everything all right at the bank?" I asked carefully.
Fine.
"Just some complications with paperwork. Nothing to worry about." But he poured a second drink, then a third. That night, he didn't come to bed. I found him asleep in his office chair at 3 a.m., still fully dressed, surrounded by papers. The trap was closing. Inspector Morrison had the evidence. The investigation had begun. But Richard didn't know I was the source.
Not yet.
The next day was September 3rd, 1969. The day the transfer was scheduled to arrive at the bank. I dressed the children for school with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Made breakfast that no one ate. Richard left early without saying goodbye, his face grim and set. "Is Daddy angry?" Sophie asked, watching him leave. "He's just worried about work, sweetheart," I said, smoothing her hair. "Everything will be fine." I had no idea if that was true. I dropped the children at my sister-in-law Lucinda's house, claiming I needed to finish an urgent sewing project without interruptions. If something went wrong today, if Richard came home and confronted me, I needed the children far away. Then I returned home and waited. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every sound made me jump. Every car that passed could be Richard coming home early. Coming home angry. Coming home to eliminate the wife who discovered too much. I kept a kitchen knife in my pocket. If he came through that door with violence in his eyes, I'd defend myself. I'd survived this long. I wouldn't go down without a fight. At 4 p.m., Mrs. Brennan appeared at my door, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Mrs. Hayes, there are police at the bank. From the Capitol. They came with the transfer money, but also with Inspector Morrison and several investigators. Mr. Edward is in custody. Your husband." She paused, breathless. "They're questioning him now. There's talk of embezzlement, fraud, years of stealing from clients." I gripped the doorframe, genuinely needing support despite having orchestrated everything. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake. They have evidence. Documents, photos. Someone sent everything to Inspector Morrison anonymously." She looked at me with sudden suspicion. "Mrs. Hayes, did you?" "I don't know anything about Richard's work," I said firmly. "I'm just a housewife who sews." She nodded slowly, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. At 8 p.m., I heard sirens. 3 police cars raced past our house toward the center of town. Then silence. Terrible, waiting silence. At 8:30, there was pounding on my door. I grabbed the kitchen knife before answering. It was Lucinda, Richard's sister, pale and breathless. Eleanor, they've arrested him. Richard and Edward both. They tried to steal $500,000 from the transfer. The whole town is in shock. They're saying Richard's been embezzling money for years. I let myself collapse into a chair, the knife still hidden in my pocket.
No.
That can't be true. There's more. Lucinda's voice dropped to a whisper. They found tickets to Argentina. And there's another woman, Eleanor. In Richmond. She's pregnant. They say Richard was planning to leave with her, start a new life. Each word confirmed what I already knew, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that photographs and love letters hadn't. The children, I whispered. Oh God, the children. They're safe at my house. They can stay as long as you need. Eleanor, what are you going to do? What was I going to do? I had just exposed my husband's crimes to the authorities. Saved $500,000 from being stolen. Protected innocent people from losing their savings when the scheme collapsed. And I'd saved my own life. Richard was in jail. The note in the Bible would never be executed. The plan to kill me had died with his arrest. I was alive. My children were safe. But now came the aftermath. The scandal. The judgment. The whispers. The life I knew was over. I don't know, I told Lucinda honestly. I truly don't know. That night, alone in the house for the first time in 10 years, I sat in the dark and let myself cry. Not for Richard. He'd forfeited my tears the moment he'd written that note, made that plan, decided I was disposable. I cried for the woman I'd been. The naive wife who'd believed in her marriage. The version of Eleanor who thought she was safe, loved, valued. That woman was dead. In her place was someone new. Someone who'd found a death threat and turned it into a weapon. Someone who'd investigated a criminal conspiracy while playing the perfect housewife. Someone who'd outsmarted men who thought she was too stupid and submissive to be a threat. I didn't know who this new Eleanor would become. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would survive. The scandal consumed our town like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew. Richard Hayes and Edward Morrison, two of the town's most respected men, were criminals, embezzlers, frauds. The Bible heist, newspapers called it, because of the note found in Scripture. I became an object of fascinated horror overnight. The betrayed wife. How could she not have known? What did she do to drive him away? Was she involved? The morning after Richard's arrest, I forced myself to walk to the market despite wanting to hide forever. I wore my best dress, held my head high, and faced the stares and whispers head-on. If I hid, they'd say I was guilty, complicit, ashamed. I had nothing to be ashamed of. I was the victim who'd refused to play the role written for her. At the butcher shop, conversations stopped when I entered. Women I'd known for years suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. The silence was suffocating until Mrs. Cooper, the innkeeper who'd unknowingly delivered my evidence, spoke up. Mrs. Hayes, how brave you are. Is there anything we can do to help with the children? It broke the ice. Not everyone was cruel. Some people understood. I bought what I needed and left with my head still high, though inside I was trembling. The next ordeal was the police station. I had to give an official statement. The authorities needed to confirm I wasn't involved in the embezzlement scheme. Mrs. Hayes, Inspector Morrison said when I arrived, we need to ask you some questions about your husband's activities. I told them everything or almost everything. I described finding the note in the Bible 2 weeks ago. My investigation. The discoveries about Marianne. The evidence I'd gathered. I omitted only one detail, that I was the anonymous source who'd sent him the evidence. Something told me to keep that secret, at least for now. The interrogation lasted for excruciating hours. They asked about our finances, Richard's travels, whether I'd noticed unusual behavior. I answered truthfully I had noticed everything, just not until 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Hayes, Inspector Morrison said finally, your husband and Mr. Morrison maintained a sophisticated embezzlement operation for at least 3 years. They created ghost accounts using deceased clients' information, siphoned small amounts consistently, and planned to steal the textile factory transfer as their final score before fleeing. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely steady. They'll be prosecuted. Given the evidence, conviction is certain. You'll likely lose this house. It was financed through the bank. And there's the matter of... He hesitated. The other woman. Miss Oliver in Richmond. What about her? She claims she didn't know about the embezzlement. Says your husband told her he was divorced, that you'd agreed to separate amicably. She's 7 months pregnant and will not be charged unless evidence of her involvement surfaces. A strange feeling washed over me. Not jealousy, but something closer to pity. Marian had been deceived too, just differently. She thought she was getting a devoted husband and father. Instead, she got a criminal and an absent partner. Before I left, Inspector Morrison called me aside. Mrs. Hayes, we received an anonymous tip 2 weeks ago. Detailed evidence of the scheme, documents, photographs, everything we needed to build our case. Whoever sent it was thorough, meticulous. He paused, watching my face. It was you, wasn't it? I held his gaze without confirming or denying. He handed me his card. Whoever did it saved not just themselves, but potentially dozens of families who would have lost their savings when this collapsed. That takes extraordinary courage. He lowered his voice. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to contact me. I took the card and left, feeling the weight of what I'd done settling on my shoulders. I destroyed my husband's life, exposed him, sent him to prison. But he planned to kill me, to abandon our children, to steal from innocent people. I'd simply refused to be his victim. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Edward received 12. The mastermind always pays more. The trial was a media spectacle. Our small town had never seen anything like it. I had to explain to Daniel and Sophie that their father had done terrible things and would be gone for a long time. Doesn't he love us anymore? Sophie asked, tears streaming down her 8-year-old face. I knelt down and held her close. What your father did has nothing to do with his love for you. Sometimes adults make terrible choices and have to face consequences. But I'm here. I'll always be here. Daniel, at 10 years old, was old enough to understand more. Did he really plan to leave us? For another family? The question broke my heart. Yes, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I hate him, Daniel said, his young face hard with betrayal. You don't have to decide how to feel right now, I told him. Those feelings are yours to work through. We had 30 days to vacate the house. The bank reclaimed it as partial compensation for the stolen funds. Everything we'd built, gone in a scandal that destroyed reputations and livelihoods. Some friends abandoned us immediately, afraid of association with the criminal's family.
But others surprised me.
Mrs. Cooper offered free lodging at the inn for as long as we needed. Mrs. Patterson gave me sewing work and referred her wealthy friends. Father Anselm organized a collection at church to help us get back on our feet. Louise in the Capitol confirmed her offer, a small room behind her sewing studio. Not much, but it was refuge. A new start. The day we moved, I packed our few belongings while the children said goodbye to their rooms, their friends, their old lives. I took one last walk through the house, stopping at Richard's office. The Bible still sat on the shelf. I pulled it down, found the note still tucked in Proverbs. Those 7 words that had changed everything. If she discovers the truth, Una live her. I took the note. Evidence, perhaps, or a reminder of what I'd survived. Then I left that office, that house, that life behind forever. At the bus station, familiar faces came to say goodbye. Lucinda hugged her nephew and niece, promising to visit during holidays. Mrs. Patterson pressed an envelope into my hand. A loan, she whispered, to start your business. Pay me back when you can. The bus ride to the Capitol took 4 hours. Daniel stared out the window, watching his childhood disappear. Sophie slept fitfully in my lap. I watched my reflection in the glass, a 29-year-old woman, officially separated, homeless, with 2 traumatized children and an uncertain future. But alive. We were alive. 2 years passed in the Capitol. Hard years, building years, surviving years. I worked at Louise's studio during the day, learning new techniques, establishing my reputation. At night, after the children were asleep, I created my own designs, dreaming of independence. Daniel and Sophie adjusted to city schools. Daniel threw himself into academics with fierce determination, as if success could erase his father's crimes. Sophie found solace in art, drawing and painting her feelings when words failed. We lived in the small room behind Louise's studio for 6 months before I saved enough for a tiny apartment. 2 bedrooms, barely big enough for the 3 of us, but it was ours. I sewed curtains, we painted the walls together, and slowly we built something resembling a home. Money was constantly tight. I counted every penny, took every sewing job offered, worked until my fingers ached and my eyes burned. But we were making it. Slowly, painfully, we were surviving. Then one rainy October afternoon in 1971, someone knocked on my apartment door. Daniel answered before I could stop him. "Mom, there's a lady with a baby." I walked to the door, hands still covered in chalk from marking a pattern. Marian stood there, soaked from rain, holding an infant, looking haunted. Time stopped. This was the woman Richard had chosen over me. The one he'd bought that expensive ring for. The reason for the secret house, the first Thursday visits, the entire double life. Every rational instinct screamed to slam the door. But I looked at her face, gaunt, exhausted, desperate, and at the baby sleeping in her arms. "Please," she whispered. "I have nowhere else to go." I should have refused. Should have sent her away. But something in her eyes reminded me of my own reflection 2 years ago, a woman pushed to the edge, fighting to survive. "Come in," I heard myself say. "You're soaked." She collapsed onto my small sofa, still clutching the baby protectively. Daniel and Sophie watched with wide eyes, sensing the significance of this moment even if they didn't understand it. "Children," I said carefully, "this lady needs some help. Daniel, get a towel. Sophie, put water on for tea." After they left, Marian spoke, words tumbling out desperately. "I lost everything. The house was rented in Richard's name. I was evicted after the scandal. I went back to my parents in Norfolk, but when Charles was born, my father couldn't stand the shame. Called him a bastard. Threw us out." She looked down at the sleeping baby. "I tried to find teaching work, but doors closed everywhere once people knew my story. I've been staying in cheap motels, but the money's almost gone." "Why come to me?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Because you survived. You rebuilt. I heard you opened a studio, that you're making something of yourself. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. I can do anything. Clean, answer phones, bookkeeping. I just need a chance." I studied her face. This woman had written those letters calling me, that woman who never deserved him. Had been part of the plan, even if unknowingly, that would have ended with my death. But she was also young, barely 25, with an infant and no prospects. Richard had used her as thoroughly as he'd used me, just in different ways. "The baby," I said. "Is he?" "Richard's." "Yes. 10 months old. His name is Charles. My children's half-brother. Born from adultery and lies, but innocent of all of it. I have a storage room," I said slowly. "Very small, but there's space for a mattress and a crib. And I do need help with the business side. I'm terrible at accounting. The pay won't be much at first, but it includes the room and meals." Her eyes filled with tears. "You'd help me? After everything?" "I'm not doing this for you," I said honestly. "I'm doing it for Charles. He's brother to Daniel and Sophie. And maybe for myself too. I've carried anger for 2 years. It's exhausting." That night, after Marianne and Charles were settled in the storage room I'd hastily converted, I explained everything to my children. "Charles is your half-brother," I told them simply. "Your father's son with Marianne. They need help, and we're going to provide it." Daniel frowned. "She's the reason Dad left us." "No," I corrected gently. "Your father's choices are the reason. Marian was lied to, just like we were. And Charles is innocent." Sophie, ever compassionate at 8 years old, asked, "Can I play with him?" "Of course, sweetheart." The arrangement was uncomfortable at first. Marianne could barely look me in the eye, weighted with shame and gratitude. The children alternated between curiosity and confusion. Neighbors gossiped viciously. The betrayed wife and the mistress living together was scandalous material. But slowly, unexpectedly, it began to work. Marianne had an organizational mind that complemented my creative chaos. Within weeks, she'd systematized my appointment scheduling, created an actual bookkeeping system, and freed me to focus on design and creation. With her handling administration, I could take more complex commissions, increasing our income. The small apartment became crowded, but we managed. The children adapted remarkably fast. Sophie doted on baby Charles, delighting in having a little brother to help care for. Daniel remained more reserved, but still helped Marianne with tasks when she seemed overwhelmed. Late at night, after the children slept, Marianne and I sometimes talked in the tiny kitchen. Two women united by the same man's betrayal, trying to understand how we'd ended up here. "How did you discover everything?" she asked one evening while mending Charles's clothes. I told her about the note in the Bible, the investigation, the evidence gathering, the anonymous tip to Inspector Morrison. She listened in stunned silence. "You were the anonymous source. You brought him down." "I saved my life," I corrected. "Richard planned to kill me once he didn't need me anymore." That note made it clear. "I never knew about that," she whispered, horror crossing her face. "The embezzlement, the murder plan, none of it. He told me he was divorced, that you'd agreed to separate amicably, that he just needed to finalize some paperwork." "I believe you," I said and meant it. Richard had been an expert liar. We'd both fallen for different versions of his fiction. Another night, she asked, "Have you forgiven him?" I thought carefully before answering. I don't think about forgiveness. I think about survival, about building something real from the ashes of his lies. Forgiveness seems irrelevant. She nodded slowly. I hate him sometimes. For the promises. For abandoning Charles. For destroying both our lives. "Good," I said. "Hate is honest. Better than false nostalgia." 6 months after Marian arrived, we moved to a larger apartment with 3 actual bedrooms. With both of us working, we could afford more space. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional, and slowly it began to feel like home. Our studio was growing too. Word spread about the quality of my designs and Marianne's efficient service. By 1973, we had enough steady clients to consider expanding. Mrs. Patterson, who'd loaned me startup money 2 years earlier, made a proposal: partner with her to open a proper boutique in the city center. She'd provide capital and connections. We'd provide the talent and labor. "This could change everything," Marian said, reviewing the proposal. "But it's also risky. If it fails, then we start over again," I interrupted. "We've done it before." We accepted the partnership. 3 months of frantic preparation followed. Finding the right space, renovating, hiring seamstresses, ordering supplies. I designed while Marian managed logistics, and somehow our strange partnership made it all work. The boutique opened in late 1973. Atelier Eleanor proclaimed the sign, elegant script on a black background. Inside was tastefully decorated on a tight budget. Marianne had a gift for making limited resources look expensive. The opening night was small but meaningful. Mrs. Patterson and her wealthy friends came, generating immediate commissions. Daniel, now 12, greeted guests with serious dignity. Sophie, 10 years old, distributed small lavender sachets we'd made as party favors. Charles, barely 3, charmed everyone with his easy smile. Standing in the beautiful space we'd created, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not in survival, that was necessity, but in what we'd built beyond mere survival. A successful business. A functional household. Children who were loved and supported despite their traumatic foundation. We'd taken Richard's betrayal and used it as fuel to build something he could never destroy. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought complications. By 1975, Atelier Eleanor had expanded to a second location in a newly opened shopping mall. We employed 6 seamstresses and had waiting lists for custom orders. I'd been featured in a local women's magazine. My designs praised for their elegant practicality. Daniel was now 14, brilliant in mathematics and science, already talking about studying engineering at MIT. Sophie, at 12, showed remarkable artistic talent, her sketches inspiring many of my designs. Charles, at 5, was a happy, sociable child who knew both Marianne and me as mother figures without confusion. Our household remained unconventional, 2 women raising 3 children together, bound by complicated history, but it functioned better than many traditional families. Then one afternoon in June 1976, our receptionist nervously approached me in the studio. "Mrs. Hayes, there's a man here asking for you. He says he's Richard Hayes." The pin I'd been holding clattered to the floor. Richard. After 7 years in prison, he was free. I'd known this day would eventually come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. "Tell him I'm with a client," I said, automatically buying time. But then I looked at myself in the mirror. I wasn't that terrified housewife anymore. I was a businesswoman, a survivor, someone who'd outsmarted him and built a life from the ruins of his betrayal. "No," I corrected. "Tell him to wait in reception. I'll be there in 15 minutes. I finished my client's fitting with steady hands, scheduled her next appointment, then walked to reception. Richard sat uncomfortably in one of our elegant chairs, completely out of place. Prison had aged him dramatically. His hair was completely white now, face deeply lined. He wore a cheap suit, probably purchased from a discount store, nothing like the expensive clothes he'd once prided himself on. Our eyes met, and I felt nothing. No anger, no residual affection, just a vague curiosity about this stranger who'd once controlled my life. "Eleanor," he said, standing awkwardly. "Richard," I replied coolly. "Let's talk in my office." I led him through the studio, aware of my employees watching with barely concealed curiosity. They all knew my story. It was impossible to hide in our small, tight-knit work community. My office was elegant but practical, with Sophie's artwork framed on the walls and a large desk where I could both design and manage business. It was a space that reflected who I'd become: professional, independent, successful. "You've built something impressive," Richard said, looking around with what seemed like genuine surprise. "What do you want?" I asked directly, sitting behind my desk while he remained standing, the power dynamic clearly reversed from our old life. "To see my children," he said. "Daniel and Sophie. They're almost grown now. I missed so much." "You missed it by choice," I reminded him. "You chose embezzlement, fraud, adultery, and planning to abandon them. Whatever you missed is consequence, not tragedy." He flinched but didn't argue. "I know. I've had 7 years to think about my choices. To regret them. Is regret supposed to move me?"
No.
He looked down at his worn shoes. "I don't expect your forgiveness or your sympathy. I just want a chance to know my children before they're completely grown." I studied him, this diminished man who'd once planned my murder. "Daniel is 15. Sophie is 13. They're old enough to decide for themselves whether they want contact with you. I won't force them either way." "That's fair," he said quietly. "And Charles? Marianne's son. I heard he's here too. That you took them in." "Yes," I said, offering no explanation. "Why?" The question seemed genuinely bewildered. "After everything I did, why would you help her?" "Because Charles is Daniel and Sophie's half-brother. Because Marianne was deceived by you just like I was, only she had fewer resources to fight back. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know that doesn't fix anything or change what happened. But I am truly, deeply sorry for what I put you through. Sorry you got caught," I corrected. "If everything had gone according to plan, I'd be dead and you'd be in Argentina with Marianne, spending stolen money and never looking back." The blunt truth hung between us like smoke. "You're right," he admitted finally. "I can't claim I would have stopped if you hadn't exposed me. I'd convinced myself the lies were justified, that I deserved happiness even at everyone else's expense." He looked at me directly for the first time. "How did you figure it out?" "The police said an anonymous tip broke the case. but they never revealed who sent it. I held his gaze without answering. Let him wonder. Let him know he'd been outsmarted but never quite know how or by whom. I'll tell the children you want to see them, I said instead. The decision will be theirs. If they agree, meetings will be supervised and on our terms.
Clear? Clear, he said.
Thank you, Eleanor. Don't thank me.
This isn't about you.
It's about giving my children the chance to have closure or connection or whatever they decide they need. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, processing the encounter. I'd expected to feel something: rage, vindication, even satisfaction at seeing him reduced and humbled. Instead, I just felt tired and grateful that this broken man no longer had any power over my life. That evening, I gathered Daniel, Sophie, and Marianne in our living room. Charles was already asleep, oblivious to the adult drama swirling around him. Your father was released from prison, I said without preamble. He came to the boutique today. He wants to see you. Daniel's face immediately hardened.
No.
Sophie looked uncertain, torn between curiosity and loyalty. It's your choice, I assured them. No pressure either way. He made terrible choices, but he is still your biological father. Some people need closure, some need connection, some need nothing. All of those responses are valid. What do you think we should do?
Sophie asked.
I think you should listen to your own hearts. I'll support whatever you decide. Daniel stood abruptly. I don't need closure from a man who is ready to murder my mother and abandon his family for money. He made his choices. I'm making mine. He left the room, and I didn't try to stop him. 14 years old, and already so certain, so angry. Maybe time would soften that. Maybe it wouldn't. It wasn't my place to force forgiveness. Sophie twisted her hands nervously. I think I want to see him. Just once. I have questions. Then we'll arrange it, I said. On your terms, in a safe place. Marianne had been silent throughout, but now she spoke quietly. He wants to see Charles too. Doesn't he? Yes. After everything. After that letter rejecting us. After 7 years of nothing. Now he wants to play father? What you decide about Charles is entirely up to you, I told her. Richard has no rights here. Only requests. She looked down at her hands. I need to think about it. Sophie met Richard at a cafe near her home a week later. I accompanied her but sat at a separate table, giving them space while remaining protectively close. I watched them talk for 2 hours. Sophie showed him her artwork, and I saw Richard's eyes well with tears. She asked questions. Why did you do it? Did you ever really love us? What happens now? And he answered as honestly as shame would allow. When they finished, Sophie came to my table with red-rimmed eyes but a lighter expression, as if a weight had been lifted. I don't forgive him, she said as we walked home. But I understand him better. He's just smaller than I remembered. Less scary. Almost pathetic. People who hurt us often are, I replied. Daniel maintained his refusal to meet Richard. No amount of gentle encouragement changed his mind, and eventually I stopped trying. He'd deal with his father in his own time and way, or not at all. Marianne ultimately decided to allow supervised visits between Richard and Charles. I can't deny Charles his biological father, she explained, though her voice carried no warmth. But Richard needs to understand. I'm his mother. You're his aunt. We're his family. Richard is just a man who visits sometimes. The visits were awkward, stilted affairs. Charles, at 5 years old, had no memory of Richard and showed polite but distant interest in this stranger. Richard tried too hard, bringing toys Charles didn't need, making promises about the future that rang hollow. After the 3rd visit, Charles asked Marianne, "Why does that man keep calling himself my daddy? You and Aunt Eleanor are my family." Out of the mouths of children. Richard found work as an accountant at a small firm, nothing prestigious, barely enough to live on. His reputation was permanently destroyed. The expensive lifestyle he'd craved was forever out of reach. He lived in a tiny apartment, alone with his regrets. Meanwhile, our unconventional family continued to thrive. The boutique expanded again. Daniel won a scholarship to a prestigious prep school. Sophie's artwork was featured in a youth exhibition. Charles started kindergarten, beloved by teachers for his friendly nature. In 1978, I was invited to present a small collection at an emerging fashion event in New York, a precursor to what would eventually become Fashion Week. It was a milestone I'd never dreamed possible when I was that terrified housewife finding a death thread in a Bible. Richard attended Sophie's middle school graduation in 1979. He sat in the back, separated from our family group, a solitary figure watching the life he'd tried to destroy flourishing without him. After the ceremony, Sophie went to him briefly, let him hug her, accepted his congratulations. Then she returned to us, to Daniel, to me, to Marianne, to Charles. Her real family. It was 1980, 11 years after I'd found that note, when the most unexpected visitor arrived at our boutique. Edward Morrison, the man who'd written those 7 deadly words. The man who'd masterminded the embezzlement scheme. Richard's partner in crime. He'd been released from prison the month before after serving 9 years of his 12-year sentence. And he'd come to me asking for help. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, standing nervously in our reception area with a woman beside him. "This is Helena, my fiancée. We're getting married next month, and, well, everyone says you create the most beautiful wedding dresses." I stared at this man who'd once written, "If she discovers the truth, Unalive her about me." Now he wanted me to design a dress celebrating his love? The irony was so profound it almost made me laugh. Helena stepped forward, her voice gentle. "I know about Edward's past. He's told me everything, the embezzlement, the scheme, the note. He's not proud of what he did, but he's served his time and genuinely changed. I'm not asking you to forgive him, just to consider making my dress. I'll pay whatever you ask." I looked at Edward, truly looked at him. He was thinner, grayer, marked by years of imprisonment. But something in his eyes was different from Richard's. Where Richard still seemed to make excuses, Edward's eyes carried genuine shame and accountability. "Why come to me?" I asked. "There are dozens of dress designers in this city." "Because you're the best," Helena said simply. "And because Edward needs to face what he did, not hide from it. Asking you for help is his way of acknowledging the harm and hoping for something resembling redemption." I could have refused. Should have refused. This man had facilitated a plan that included my murder. But I thought about the woman I'd become. How I'd taken Marianne in despite her being part of Richard's betrayal. How I'd built a life based not on revenge, but on transformation. "Come with me, Helena," I said finally. "Let's discuss what you envision for your wedding." Edward's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. I spent an hour with Helena, discussing fabrics and styles, taking measurements, sketching ideas. She was kind, genuine, clearly in love. Whatever Edward had been, he'd apparently found someone who saw possibilities in his future rather than just shame in his past. When they left, Marian asked me quietly, "Why did you agree?" "After what he did." "Because 11 years ago, I found a note that should have destroyed me," I replied. "Instead, it saved me. Gave me this life, this family, this business. If I'd let hatred rule me, I'd be as trapped as Richard is now, imprisoned by bitterness even without bars." "So you forgive him?" "No," I said honestly. "But I'm choosing not to let him take anything more from me. Not even my peace of mind." I created Helena's dress. It was beautiful, lace and silk, elegant and romantic. At their small wedding, I watched from the back as Edward married this woman who believed in second chances. He saw me there and nodded slowly, not a gesture of friendship, but of acknowledgement. We would never be close. The past was too dark for that. But we could coexist in the same city, the same world, without destroying each other further. The years continued their steady march. Daniel graduated from MIT with a degree in engineering and started his own construction firm. Sophie attended Rhode Island School of Design and eventually returned to partner with me at the boutique, bringing fresh creative energy to my established designs. Charles, raised by 2 strong women with 2 older siblings who doted on him, grew into a confident young man with a gift for business management. By the time he was 20, he was handling all financial operations for our expanding empire. Marianne and I never separated, never stopped being partners. Our relationship confounded people, the wife and the mistress building a business dynasty together, but we'd long ago stopped caring about judgment. We're more than business partners, Marianne said once during an interview for a business magazine. We're family, forged in tragedy, strengthened by survival. The boutique became a nationally respected brand. We opened locations in multiple cities. I officially retired from daily operations in my late 60s, leaving the business to Sophie and Charles while I focused on mentoring young designers. Richard died in 1995 of a sudden heart attack. He was 63, living alone in that same tiny apartment, working at the same low-level accounting job. At his funeral, we all came, Daniel, Sophie, Charles, Marianne, and me. Not because we'd forgiven him, but because we'd moved so far beyond his betrayal that it no longer defined us. Sophie cried at the funeral, though she'd barely maintained contact with Richard in his final years. I'm not crying for him, she explained later. I'm crying for what could have been if he'd made different choices. Daniel remained stoic, dry-eyed, unmoved. He'd never reconciled with his father, never regretted that choice. Charles, who'd seen Richard occasionally throughout childhood but never developed a real relationship, seemed mostly confused by the complicated emotions swirling around him. After the funeral, we gathered at our home, the large, beautiful house Marianne and I had bought together in the late 80s, with separate wings but shared common spaces, a physical representation of our unusual family structure. Do you ever wonder, Sophie asked as we sat in the living room, how different our lives would have been if you hadn't found that note? Every day, I admitted. If the Bible hadn't fallen, if the note had stayed hidden, if my migraine hadn't driven me to Richard's office that afternoon, I'd probably be dead. You too would have been abandoned. The whole trajectory would have been different. The note was meant to threaten you, Daniel observed, his engineering mind analyzing the physics of fate. Instead, it saved you. That's statistically remarkable. It's more than statistics, Marianne said softly. It's Eleanor's courage. She could have frozen in fear, confronted Richard directly, or ignored the warning signs. Instead, she investigated, gathered evidence, planned strategically. The note gave information, but Eleanor's actions gave survival. That's the part one want people to understand, I said, thinking about the story I'd lived. Bad things happen, betrayals occur, threats materialize. But we're not powerless. We have choices in how we respond, even when those choices are terrifying. I'm 78 now, sitting in a comfortable chair in the same house where that conversation took place decades ago. Marianne, 74, lives in the East Wing. We still have coffee together most mornings, still run ideas past each other, still finish each other's sentences like old married couples do. My 6 grandchildren are scattered across the country, pursuing their own dreams. Daniel's construction firm builds sustainable housing. Sophie still designs, though now she's branched into costume design for theater and film. Charles runs the business empire we built, expanding it in ways I never imagined. Sometimes young women come to me, journalists, students, documentary filmmakers, wanting to hear about the Bible heist scandal, about how the betrayed wife and the mistress built a fashion empire together, about survival and transformation. I tell them the truth. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, days I wanted to give up, moments when survival seemed impossible. But I also tell them about the note that changed everything. 7 words that should have been my death sentence became my liberation. If she discovers the truth, Una live her. I discovered the truth. And instead of being killed, I killed the old Eleanor, the submissive wife, the woman who didn't ask questions, who accepted what she was told. In her place rose someone stronger. Someone who investigated instead of panicking. Someone who gathered evidence instead of confronting prematurely. Someone who protected her children while building a new future. Do you ever regret it? A young journalist asked me recently. Exposing Richard, destroying your marriage, all of it? I looked at her with complete certainty. The only thing I regret is not seeing the truth sooner. But I can't regret actions that saved my life and gave my children a future built on honesty rather than lies. And Marian, she pressed, do you regret helping her? Never, I said firmly. She was a victim too, just differently. Together, we built something neither of us could have achieved alone. That's not charity, that's strategy. The young journalist smiled. You're quite remarkable, Mrs. Hayes. No, I corrected. I'm a survivor. There's a difference. Remarkable people do extraordinary things. Survivors do what's necessary. But perhaps that is remarkable in its own way. Late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I sometimes take out that old note from the locked box where I keep it. The paper is yellowed now, fragile, the handwriting faded. If she discovers the truth, Una her. 7 words written by a man who thought I was too stupid, too submissive, too trapped to be a threat. He was wrong. I discovered the truth, and instead of dying, I lived more authentically than I ever had before. The note that should have ended my story became its beginning. And that, I think, is the real lesson. We don't always get to choose what happens to us. Betrayal comes. Threats materialize. Life shatters our comfortable illusions. But we always get to choose how we respond. Fear or courage. Paralysis or action. Victim or survivor. I chose courage. I chose action. I chose survival. And 50 years later, I'm still here to tell the story. Because that's what survivors do. We survive, we build, and we tell our stories so others know they can too.